She collapsed on the living room floor, writhing in pain, while he raised a glass to another woman. The call was ignored, the emergency dismissed as drama. The screams faded to silence, and the blood became evidence. He ran from responsibility, but not from the truth. If this story grabs you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. Night was falling over New York City with that signature density of a great metropolis, when the silence of the affluent neighborhood stands in brutal contrast to the incessant pulse of the city that never sleeps. On the Upper East Side, one of Manhattan's most exclusive enclaves, Madison Hayes's mansion glowed under the soft light of the ornate lampposts that adorned the tree-lined street. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The large windows revealed crystal chandeliers, European designer furniture, and carefully selected works of art. It was the kind of residence featured in interior design magazines, the kind that makes people sigh and dream of a life far removed from their own reality. The property occupied a quarter-acre lot, with gardens designed by a renowned landscape architect and a pool that reflected the house's lights like a liquid mirror. There was a 4-car garage, a climate-controlled wine cellar in the basement, and a home theater that was rarely used. Everything about it breathed understated opulence, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to scream to be noticed. It was the dream of many, the envy of countless others. But dreams, as Madison was about to discover in the most brutal way, can turn into nightmares when reality decides to show its cruelest face. But inside that immaculate house on that specific October night, what reigned was not the harmony the facade suggested. It was silence, a heavy, dense silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Madison was alone, completely alone, and 7.5 months pregnant. She walked slowly through the living room, one hand on her lower back, the other caressing the prominent belly that carried her first child, her son. With each passing day, the baby became more real to her, more tangible. She had chosen his name with such care, Michael. A strong, beautiful name, meaning, "Who is like God?" She had spent weeks decorating his nursery, personally selecting every detail, the fine wood crib, the curtains with soft prints of woodland animals, the musical mobile that played a lullaby. She had bought books on motherhood, attended childbirth classes, and talked to other mothers. She was ready, or at least she thought she was. The contractions had started about an hour ago. At first, they were just bearable discomforts, the kind of twinges every expectant mother anticipates in the final months. But now, the intensity was increasing at an alarming rate. Each wave of pain came stronger, faster, squeezing her abdomen with a force that left her breathless. This wasn't normal. She knew it wasn't normal. She had talked enough with her obstetrician, read enough information to recognize when something was wrong. And something was definitely wrong. Madison tried to breathe as she had learned in her childbirth classes. Inhale deeply, exhale slowly, visualize the pain as something fleeting, like ocean waves that come and go. But her body didn't seem willing to cooperate. The controlled breathing that was supposed to calm her only made her more aware that she was hyperventilating. Sweat trickled down her forehead, dampening her brown hair, which fell in wet strands across her face. She felt a warm liquid run down her legs, and looked down, terrified. Her water had broken. The Italian marble floor, always impeccable, always gleaming under the light of the chandeliers, was now wet. And there was blood. More blood than there should be. Much more. Panic began to rise in her throat like a cold hand squeezing her windpipe. Her eyes widened, and her heart hammered in a violent, irregular rhythm. She looked around, searching for her cell phone. Where was it? She was absolutely sure she had left it on the console table near the entrance when she got home a few hours ago. But in the confusion of the moment, with the pain consuming every rational thought, everything seemed distant, blurry, as if she were looking through a fogged-up window. She took a few shaky steps toward the table, her legs trembling under her own weight, but another contraction hit with devastating force. Her knees buckled like dry twigs, and she fell, catching herself with her hands on the cold floor. The impact echoed through the empty room. The pain was indescribable. It wasn't just physical, not just the sensation of muscles contracting beyond their natural limit. There was something primitive, visceral about it, as if her body were being torn in half by forces she couldn't control. It was as if every cell in her being was screaming in despair. Madison tried to get up, pressing her hands against the cold marble, trying to summon the strength to push her body upward. But she couldn't. Her legs wouldn't respond to her brain's desperate commands. It was as if the connection between her mind and her limbs had been severed. The bleeding was getting worse. She could feel it, warm against her skin, soaking her light cotton clothes, which now clung to her sweaty body. With immense effort, she began to crawl toward the console table. Every inch was a battle. The cold marble under her hands, the sound of her own ragged breathing echoing in the empty room, the weight of the baby pressing against her pelvis. She had to reach the phone, she had to call for help. But most of all, she needed him. She needed Richard. Richard Sterling, entrepreneur, investor, owner of a fortune built on real estate deals and strategic stakes in tech companies. 43 years old with graying temples that gave him an air of calculated distinction, an easy smile, and a charm that seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror. He had the kind of presence that commanded attention when he walked into a room. He wore perfectly tailored Italian suits, Swiss watches that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and spoke 3 languages fluently. He was the type of man who knew exactly which wine to order at any restaurant and who greeted waiters by name to demonstrate both familiarity and power. Madison had met him 3 years earlier at a charity gala at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. A black-tie evening where New York's elite gathered to write generous checks and pose for society magazines. He was recently separated from his second wife. She was an art curator at a renowned gallery in Soho. They had mutual friends, moved in the same social circles, frequented the same places. The romance was intense, overwhelming, the kind that makes a woman forget to pay attention to the red flags that have been flashing since the first date. And the signs were there, right from the start, as glaring as fire alarms for anyone willing to listen. The way he avoided highly public commitments, preferring dinners at discreet restaurants, the calls he took in another room, lowering his voice and closing doors, the business trips that extended beyond their scheduled dates without detailed explanations, the weekends he simply vanished, claiming last-minute meetings or unavoidable commitments. His social media was practically non-existent, a cold, distant corporate profile with no personal photos, no displays of affection. But Madison, in love and enchanted by this man who seemed to have stepped out of a modern fairy tale, chose not to see. She chose to believe the explanations he gave so naturally. She chose to trust him when all her friends whispered their concerns. She chose to believe that love would be enough to fill the gaps he deliberately left in his stories. After all, he was kind when they were together. He brought her flowers for no reason. He took her on surprise trips. He listened to her stories about art and feigned genuine interest. How could you not fall in love with someone like that? When she discovered she was pregnant 6 months ago, on a Saturday morning that began with unexpected nausea, Madison imagined the news would bring them closer, that they would finally have the family she had always dreamed. So that maybe, just maybe, he would stop being so evasive and truly commit. When she showed him the 2 pink lines on the home pregnancy test, her eyes filled with tears and her heart pounding, she expected to see joy on his face. But what she saw was surprise, yes, followed by a lukewarm, almost mechanical acceptance that she forced herself to interpret as initial shock. He promised they would be together, that he would take care of her and the baby, that he would be a good father. But since then he had become gradually more distant, more absent, colder, like a tide slowly receding from the shore, leaving only marks in the sand. Finally, Madison reached the console table. With trembling fingers, she managed to grab her cell phone. The screen illuminated her pale, sweaty face. She dialed Richard's number urgently, each tap feeling like an eternity. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Answer, please, answer. Across town, at the acclaimed restaurant Daniel, located on the Upper East Side, one of the most coveted addresses in New York's culinary scene, Richard was seated at a discreet table in the corner of the main dining room. The place was known for its Art Deco decor, Impeccable service, and above all for being the meeting spot for the city's financial elite. It was the kind of restaurant where million-dollar deals were closed between a risotto and a glass of wine, where secrets were shared in elegant whispers, where appearances were more important than reality. Across from him sat a blonde woman with long, straight hair, light eyes that sparkled in the soft candlelight, 28 years old with an ambition that could be read in her every calculated move. Jessica Morgan, a public relations executive at one of the companies in which Richard held a stake. She was elegant in a black dress that accentuated her curves without being vulgar, perfectly made up, with discreet but expensive jewelry. She knew exactly what game she was playing, and more importantly, she knew she was winning. The table was laden with carefully prepared delicacies, wild salmon carpaccio with capers and truffle oil, a porcini mushroom risotto that melted in the mouth, a bottle of Italian Barolo, a 2010 vintage, that cost more than what many Americans make in a month. The candles cast soft, dancing shadows on Jessica's face as she leaned forward strategically, lightly touching Richard's arm while talking about a new company project. Every touch was studied. Every smile had a purpose. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew he was married, or rather, that he had a pregnant partner at home. But that didn't seem to matter to either of them at that moment. Richard laughed at something she had just said, an inside joke about a difficult client. He had loosened his Italian silk tie, and the top buttons of his white shirt were open, revealing a perfect artificial tan. There was something performative about the scene, as if they were both playing rehearsed roles. The successful seducer and the ambitious young woman, a script that had been staged thousands of times in expensive restaurants all over the world. When Richard's phone vibrated on the table, interrupting his story about a recent investment in tech startups, he glanced at the illuminated screen with visible irritation. Madison's name was flashing insistently. Again, it was the third call in less than 2 hours. Every time she called, he felt that growing annoyance, that feeling of being watched, controlled, suffocated. He sighed heavily, picked up the phone, and answered with a tone that made no attempt to hide his deep annoyance. "Hi, what is it now?" Madison's voice came through, broken and desperate, shattered by sobs of pain she was trying to control. "Richard, please. You have to come home, now. My water broke and I'm bleeding a lot. I can't get up. I'm on the living room floor and the pain is unbearable. Please, I need you. Our son needs you." Richard glanced at Jessica, who was watching him with feigned curiosity, poking at her plate with a fork while trying to look, like she wasn't listening. He rolled his eyes dramatically, a theatrical gesture of exhaustion, and covered the phone's microphone with his free hand. He whispered to Jessica with a cynical smile, "She's being dramatic again. You have no idea what it's like living with a pregnant woman. Every little thing is a life-or-death situation." Jessica smiled back in complicity, though something in her eyes showed a slight discomfort that she quickly masked by taking a sip of wine. Richard returned to the phone, his tone now even more impatient, almost cruel. "Madison, you always exaggerate everything. You were like this, even before the pregnancy. It's probably just normal discomfort. All pregnant women go through this. Take a warm bath, drink some chamomile tea, and lie down for a bit. You'll see it'll pass. I'll be home later, and we can talk calmly." "Richard, it's not an exaggeration." Her voice came out in a choked scream of pain, a primitive sound that made a few people at nearby tables glance in his direction. "There's so much blood, so much. Something is very wrong. I know it is. Please, I've never asked you for anything like this. You know I'm not one to overreact. I need to go to the hospital now. I need you here with me. Our son is in danger." He looked at Jessica again, who now seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the situation, but still remained seated, swirling the red wine in her glass between her perfectly manicured fingers, pretending to be absorbed in contemplation of the drink. "Look, Madison, I can't leave right now. I'm in an extremely important business meeting. You know how these things are. There are millions at stake here. Call your doctor, Dr. Evans. She'll be able to guide you better than I can. I'm absolutely sure it's nothing serious. You've always been very sensitive to these things, very emotional. It's just pregnancy anxiety." "Richard, Please." Her voice was weak now, almost a whisper that could barely make it through the phone line. There was a plea in her tone that would have broken the heart of any minimally human person, but Richard was not just any person. "We'll talk when I get home. Bye." He hung up before she could reply, before she could beg one more time. He placed the phone back on the table, screen down so he wouldn't see if... She tried to call again and forced a smile for Jessica, as if none of it mattered. "Sorry for the interruption, where were we?" Jessica hesitated for a brief moment that seemed to stretch on much longer than it actually did. Something about that conversation had disturbed her in a way she couldn't quite define, but she wasn't known for letting principles get in the way of her goals. After taking a deep breath and another sip of wine, she returned the professional smile she had perfected over the years. "You were telling me about the new project on Park, haven't you? The luxury development?" And the conversation resumed as if nothing had happened, as if just a few miles away, a woman wasn't literally fighting for her life and the life of her child. Richard picked up his glass of Barolo, admired its deep ruby color against the candlelight, savored a generous sip that left his lips slightly stained, and went back to talking about business, about investments, about the millions that flowed through his hands with the same ease and carelessness that other people use to make change at a bakery. The restaurant continued its sophisticated, unperturbed rhythm. The grand piano in the background played a soft Chopin melody. Waiters moved with choreographed precision between the tables, balancing expensive dishes on silver trays. The world kept spinning, indifferent to individual suffering. Back at the mansion on the Upper East Side, Madison still held the phone in disbelief. He had hung up. Just hung up. Tears began to stream down her face, mixing with the sweat. The pain returned, stronger than before, and she had to bite her own lip to keep from screaming. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. She looked down at her belly where her son was moving weakly. "Hang on, my love," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Mommy's going to get help. We're going to be okay. I promise." With trembling fingers, she dialed 911, the number every American learns as a child but hopes never to use. The call was answered almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency?" "Please, I need an ambulance," Madison managed to say, fighting against the waves of pain. "I'm 7.5 months pregnant, my water broke, there's a lot of bleeding and I can't get up, I'm home alone." The operator maintained a calm, professional voice. "Can you give me your full address, please?" Madison recited the address, each word a struggle. The operator asked questions, trying to assess the severity of the situation, frequency of contractions, amount of bleeding, level of consciousness. Madison answered as best she could, but she felt her strength fading. "An ambulance has been dispatched and is on its way. It should arrive in approximately 12 minutes. Can you stay conscious until then?" "I'll try," Madison whispered. But as she spoke, she felt her vision start to darken at the edges. The room was spinning. "Save my baby," she managed to say before everything went black. Ma'am, can you hear me? Please respond." But Madison could no longer respond. Her body had reached its limit. She passed out right there, on the cold living room floor, surrounded by a luxury that meant absolutely nothing at that moment. The phone slipped from her hand and fell beside her, the operator's voice still calling from the other end. The minutes dragged on like hours. The house remained silent, only the muffled sounds of the city filtering through the windows. The clock on the wall ticked off each second with relentless precision. 8:43 p.m. A typical Thursday night for most people, but for Madison and her son, it was the night everything would change forever. The ambulance cut through the New York traffic with sirens blaring, clearing a path between cars that scrambled to pull over. Inside, the paramedic team had already been briefed on the severity of the case. Pregnant woman in premature labor, hemorrhaging, loss of consciousness. Every second counted. The driver floored the accelerator whenever possible, mentally calculating the best route through the busy streets. At Daniel, Richard had ordered dessert. Tiramisu for him, panna cotta for Jessica. They were chatting animatedly about a trip they were planning, a weekend in the Hamptons perhaps, or maybe something further, a beach in the Caribbean. Jessica suggested options, while Richard smiled and agreed, already imagining the days away from demands, away from responsibilities, away from Madison. Richard's phone vibrated again. This time, it was an unknown number. He considered not answering, but something made him pick it up. "Hello? Mr. Richard Sterling?" It was a woman's voice, formal and urgent. "Yes, this is he. Who's calling?" "This is Mount Sinai Hospital. Are you the partner of Madison Hayes?" Richard felt something tighten in his stomach. "Yes, I am. What happened?" "You need to come to the hospital immediately, sir. Ms. Hayes was admitted in critical condition. She's in premature labor with serious complications. We need authorization for emergency procedures." Richard was silent for a few seconds, processing the information. Jessica watched him, sensing something was wrong. He cleared his throat. "Look, I'm in an important meeting right now. Can't she call later?" "Sir, you don't understand the gravity of the situation." The nurse's voice hardened. "This is a life-threatening situation, for both her and the baby. You need to come now to sign the surgical consent forms." "She's always been very dramatic about these things," Richard said, looking at Jessica, who held her fork halfway to her mouth. "I'm sure everything will be fine. Can't you just handle it there?" There was a tense silence on the other end of the line. When the nurse spoke again, her tone was one of restrained disbelief. "Mr. Sterling, your partner is unconscious. She arrived by ambulance in critical condition. The doctors are evaluating the need for an emergency C-section. If you can't come, we need to contact one of her family members who can take on this responsibility." Richard sighed with impatience. "Look, do whatever you need to do. I trust your work. I can't come now, but as soon as I'm done here, I'll stop by." "Sir, do you understand that it might be too late if—" "I said I'll stop by later. Now, if you'll excuse me." And he hung up again, this time more harshly. Jessica put her fork back on the plate, her dessert untouched. "Is everything okay?" she asked, though she knew it wasn't. "Oh, it's Madison. Apparently she's at the hospital. But you know how pregnant women are, right? Every little thing is a drama. She's probably just looking for attention." He forced a smile and picked up his dessert spoon. "Let's enjoy our night. I'm not going to let her ruin our dinner." But Jessica could no longer smile with the same ease. Something about the situation deeply unsettled her. She poked at her dessert without really eating, while Richard continued to talk about various topics, trying to maintain the evening's normalcy. At Mount Sinai Hospital, one of the best medical institutions in the country, Madison was surrounded by a team of professionals working at a frantic pace. The obstetric emergency unit had been activated as soon as the ambulance arrived. Doctors, nurses, technicians, all moving with the precision of those accustomed to handling emergencies. "Pressure's dropping," a nurse announced, watching the monitors. 80 over 50. "Prep for a possible emergency C-section," ordered the on-call obstetrician, Dr. Helen Reed, a 50-year-old woman with over 2 decades of experience. "And has anyone been able to contact the baby's father?" "He refused to come, doctor," replied the nurse who had made the call, still in disbelief over the conversation. "He said she was being dramatic." Dr. Reed closed her eyes for a brief second, taking a deep breath to control her anger. She had seen a lot in her career, but this kind of situation still shocked her. "Then we need to find another legal guardian. Does she have any other family?" "We're trying to locate her father. His name is listed as her emergency contact." At that very moment, about 25 miles away, in a middle-class residential neighborhood in Queens where houses had small yards and neighbors greeted each other on the street, Alan Hayes was sitting in his modest living room, watching the CBS Evening News. At 62, he was a strong-looking man despite his age, with broad shoulders that still revealed the posture of someone who once wore a uniform, completely white hair cut short as he had always kept it during his years of service, and deep brown eyes that carried the sadness of someone who had lost much in life, but also the determination of someone who never gave up the fight. Alan was a retired NYPD detective, where he had worked for over 35 years. He had joined the force young, driven by a sense of justice his simple parents had instilled in him since childhood. He rose through the ranks not through political connections or influential patrons, but through sheer competence and hard work. He was known among his colleagues as incorruptible, meticulous, someone who wouldn't rest until a case was solved. He had seen the worst of humanity in his cases: brutal homicides, kidnappings that ended in tragedy, frauds that destroyed entire families. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his long career had prepared him for the day he had to deal with the greatest tragedy of his own life. Cecilia, his wife, the love of his life since they met as teenagers at a church dance in the neighborhood where they grew up. She was an elementary school teacher, with a smile that could light up any room and infinite patience with difficult students. They married young, had Madison when he was 25, and built a simple but happy life. But when Madison was just 17, a senior in high school full of dreams about studying art history in college, Cecilia began to experience persistent abdominal pain. The tests revealed an aggressive cancer that had already spread. In less than 8 months she was gone, leaving a void that would never be completely filled. Since then it had been just him and Madison, a strong, close relationship built on unconditional love and mutual protection. He worked double shifts to pay for her college, never complained about the overtime, and sold the car he loved to cover expenses when needed. He watched his daughter graduate, get a job at a renowned art gallery, and build a brilliant career as a curator. He was proud of her in a way words couldn't adequately express, and he was willing to do anything to protect her, just as he had promised Cecilia on her deathbed. When Madison first introduced Richard 3 years ago, at a Sunday lunch at his house in Queens, Alan never fully trusted the man. His experience as a detective had honed his instincts over the decades. He could read people like others read books. And there was something about Richard's manner, the way he avoided direct eye contact when asked about his intentions with Madison, the vague and evasive answers when questioned about future plans, the smile that never reached his eyes, that set off every alarm in his head. But Madison was in love, radiant in a way he hadn't seen since before Cecilia's death, and he didn't want to be the controlling, overprotective father who pushes his only daughter away. So he did what he could. He told her he would always be there no matter what. He made it clear that for anything, at any time, she could count on him, and he waited with that uneasy feeling in his stomach that something bad was coming. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked at the landline on the side table with some surprise. Few people called that number these days. He answered with his deep, firm voice. "Hello? Mr. Alan Hayes? This is Mount Sinai Hospital. It's about your daughter, Madison." Alan's heart instantly leapt into his throat. "What's wrong with my daughter?" The nurse explained the situation as clearly as possible, without omitting the gravity of her condition. As he listened, Alan was already on his feet, fumbling for his car keys with one hand while holding the phone with the other. "I'm on my way now. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Do whatever is necessary to save my daughter and my grandson. I take full responsibility." He hung up, grabbed his wallet, and practically ran out of the house. He got into the old silver Corolla in the garage and sped off, turning on the GPS to calculate the fastest route to the hospital. As he drove, his hands firm on the wheel, 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. How did this happen? Where was Richard? Why was Madison alone? The answers to those questions would start to become clear very soon. And when they did, Alan would use all his experience as a detective to ensure the truth came out. Because he wasn't just a worried father, he was a man who had dedicated his life to seeking justice. And this time, justice was for his own daughter. The New York night continued its course, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding under its lights. The ambulance that had brought Madison was now parked in the hospital's emergency bay, being cleaned and prepped for the next call. At Daniel, the lights were soft, and the music continued to play. And in an operating room at Mount Sinai, a medical team was fighting against time to save 2 lives that depended on every second. Fate had set all the players in their places, and the night was still far from over. The New York night was in full swing when Alan Hayes pulled into the parking garage of Mount Sinai Hospital, driving with a controlled urgency that only decades of experience in emergency situations could provide. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but they trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety consuming every fiber of his being. Throughout the entire drive from Queens, speeding down the FDR drive well above the speed limit, a single image dominated his mind. Madison, his only daughter, the girl he had raised alone after the devastating loss of Cecilia, now fighting for her life in an emergency room. The hospital rose before him like an illuminated fortress, its many floors shining against the city's night sky. It was one of the most renowned medical institutions in the country, known for treating celebrities, politicians, and the financial elite. But at that moment, to Alan, it was just a building where his daughter was in danger. He parked the silver Corolla in a random spot, not even bothering to check if he was within the lines, grabbed his wallet and practically ran toward the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open with an electronic whisper. The hospital lobby was vast, with gleaming marble floors, light-colored walls, and soft lighting that tried to offer comfort in an environment inevitably associated with suffering and pain. A few people were scattered on the upholstered sofas, their tired, worried faces revealing hours of waiting for news of loved ones. Soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers in the ceiling. Everything was designed to convey a sense of calm and control, but Alan knew that kind of facade well. He had spent enough time in hospitals during Cecilia's illness to know that behind that serene appearance, intense dramas were unfolding every second. He went straight to the information desk, where a young receptionist in an impeccable uniform was typing on a computer. She looked up and smiled professionally. "Good evening. How can I help you?" "My daughter was admitted a little while ago. Madison Hayes. Obstetric emergency. Where is she?" The words came out in a rapid burst, his voice thick with an emotion he struggled to control. The receptionist typed the name into the system, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Her expression grew more serious when she found the record. "She's at the obstetric surgical center, sir. 5th floor. Are you—" "I'm her father, Alan Hayes. They told me to come sign some papers." "I see. I'll let the team know you've arrived. Please take the elevators at the back and go up to the 5th floor. Someone will meet you at the reception desk there." Alan didn't wait for further explanation. He hurried in the direction she indicated, his shoes making a sharp sound against the polished marble. The elevator took an eternity to arrive, though the digital panel indicated it was only 20 seconds. When the doors finally opened, he stepped inside and pressed the button for the 5th floor with unnecessary force, as if that would make the car ascend faster. During the silent ascent, Alan closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He remembered Madison as a baby, so small she fit in his arms, looking up at him with huge, trusting eyes. He remembered her at 7, losing her first tooth and smiling gap-toothed as he took a picture. He remembered her college graduation, how beautiful she looked in her cap and gown, how proud Cecilia would have been, and he remembered the day she told him she was pregnant, her eyes shining with happiness despite the insecurity she tried to hide. He had hugged his daughter and promised that everything would be okay, that he would be there for whatever she needed. Now, he had to keep that promise more than ever. The elevator stopped with a gentle jolt. The doors opened to a wide hallway with white walls and impeccably clean grey linoleum floors. The characteristic hospital smell, that mix of disinfectant and air conditioning, filled his nostrils. To the right was a smaller waiting area with padded plastic chairs and a television on with the volume low. To the left was the nurses' station, where 3 professionals moved with quiet efficiency. Alan approached the station. A middle-aged nurse with her hair in a tight bun and kind eyes, despite her evident fatigue, noticed him immediately. "Are you Madison Hayes' father?" she asked before he could say a word. "Yes, I am." "How is she?" "Where is my daughter?" The nurse came around the counter and spoke to him in a low but direct tone. "Mr. Hayes, your daughter is in a delicate situation. She arrived unconscious with signs of severe preeclampsia and significant hemorrhaging. Her blood pressure was dangerously high and then dropped alarmingly. The baby is also in fetal distress. Dr. Helen Reed, our on-call obstetrician, has determined that an immediate emergency C-section is necessary." Alan felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He leaned on the counter for support. "Is she going to be okay? Is the baby going to be okay?" The nurse held his gaze honest. "We're doing everything in our power, But I won't lie to you, sir, it's a serious situation. We need your authorization to proceed with the surgery. We tried to contact her partner, but he—" She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "He didn't want to come." "What do you mean he didn't want to come?" Alan's voice was louder than he intended, filled with disbelief and rage. A few people in the waiting area glanced their way. "He said she was being dramatic, that he would be back later." The nurse couldn't hide the disapproval in her tone. Alan closed his eyes, clenching his fists so tightly, his nails dug into his palms. He took a deep breath, trying to control the fury erupting inside, him like a volcano. He wanted to leave, find Richard wherever he was, and do things his ex-cop conscience wouldn't allow. But this wasn't the time. His daughter needed him. His grandson needed him. "Where do I sign?" he said finally, his eyes now shining with determination. The nurse led him to a small consultation room adjacent to the station. A simple desk with 2 printed forms awaited him. They were the surgical consent forms, filled with medical jargon and warnings about risks. Alan didn't even read them. He took the pen the nurse offered and signed where indicated, each. Movement swift and decisive. "Done. Can you start now?" "The team is already preparing. Dr. Reed wants to speak with you before she begins. She's on her way." Alan nodded and stood there, unable to sit despite his trembling legs. He looked around the small room, a generic seascape painting on the wall, a pharmacy calendar, an artificial plant in the corner. All so normal, so mundane, while his daughter's life hung by a thread. The door opened and a woman in a white coat entered. She was of average height, with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and blue eyes that conveyed experience and competence. "Dr. Helen Reed." She extended her hand to Alan. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Dr. Reed. Thank you for coming so quickly." He shook her hand. "Doctor, be straight with me. What are the chances?" Helen took a deep breath. She wasn't the type to lie to comfort family members. "Your daughter has severe preeclampsia, possibly progressing to eclampsia. Her pressure was 190 over 120 when she was admitted. We managed to partially stabilize it, but then it dropped to 80 over 50. There are signs of disseminated intravascular coagulation. The baby is in distress. Every minute that passes reduces the chances for both of them. I'll be honest with you, it's a critical situation, but we have an excellent team, and we will do everything humanly possible." She was alone when this happened. It wasn't a question. It was a bitter statement. "Yes, the paramedics found your daughter unconscious on the floor. She must have crawled to the phone and called 911. She was very brave." Helen paused. "May I ask where the baby's father was?" "At dinner," the word came out like poison. "With another woman." Helen closed her eyes briefly, a muscle tensing in her jaw. In 23 years of medicine, she had seen a lot, but this kind of negligence still shocked her. "I see. Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. I'm going to prepare for the surgery. You can wait in the waiting room. As soon as we have news, we'll let you know immediately. I want to stay close as possible. There's a specific waiting room for families of surgical patients, just down the hall. Just follow the signs. You'll be closer there, and any news will reach you faster." Alan thanked her, with a nod. Helen hurried off, her footsteps echoing down the hall. He followed her to the designated waiting room, a smaller, more private space with only 6 chairs, a coffee machine, and a window overlooking the hospital's inner courtyard, now dark in the night. It was empty. Alan sat in the chair closest to the door, unable to relax, his body as tense as a guitar string. While he waited, his detective's mind started working. He took out his phone and opened his messaging app. He hesitated for a moment, then typed a message to Madison, even knowing she wouldn't read it anytime soon. "Honey, I'm here at the hospital. You're going to be okay, you and Michael, I promise. I love you more than anything." He sent it and stared at the screen, as if expecting a magical reply. Then he opened his call history. He saw Madison's calls to Richard that night, 3 calls, the last one lasting 2 minutes and 30 seconds. His stomach churned. His daughter had begged for help and had been ignored. He thought about calling Richard right then, but decided against it. Not yet. First, Madison needed to be safe. Then he would deal with that man the way he deserved. The minutes dragged on with torturous slowness, each second stretching into an eternity of anxiety. Alan got up from the stiff chair, unable to stay still, walked to the large window, and looked down at the dark, silent inner courtyard, a small island of nature amidst the city's concrete. He sat back down, but his muscles wouldn't relax. It was as if his body were in a perpetual state of high alert, ready to react to any news. He picked up his phone, checked the time on the illuminated display. 9:47 p.m. Only 10 minutes since he had last checked, though it felt like an hour had passed. He stood up again, restless, went to the coffee machine in the corner, took a white plastic cup from the stack, and pressed the espresso button. The dark, hot liquid dripped with a monotonous mechanical sound, filling the cup and releasing a strong aroma that filled the small room. He didn't even like coffee much, always preferring tea, but he needed something to do with his hands, something to occupy a mind that insisted on imagining the worst-case scenarios. He drank it, in small sips that burned his tongue and throat, the bitterness of the coffee perfectly matching the bitterness he felt toward Richard. He sat down again, the warm cup between his hands, and let his mind wander through memories. He remembered the day Cecilia told him she was pregnant, the joy he felt mixed with the pure terror of being responsible for a life. He remembered the birth, holding Cecilia's hand through the long hours of labor, how she squeezed his fingers so hard she left marks. He remembered seeing Madison for the first time, that tiny, perfect little being, with her eyes closed and her tiny fists clenched. He had sworn that day to always protect her no matter what, and here he was, decades later, trying to keep that promise under circumstances he never imagined. He also thought about all the cases he had investigated during his career. How many times had he witnessed the worst of human nature? How many times had he seen people hurt those they were supposed to love and protect? But this, what Richard had done, this deliberate and cruel abandonment of a pregnant woman in danger, was a different level of cruelty. It wasn't physical violence, but it was emotional violence of the worst kind. 15 minutes later, which felt like an eternity trapped in a time loop, the waiting room door creaked open. A different nurse entered, younger, perhaps in her early 30s, holding a tablet and wearing a professional but kind expression. "Mr. Hayes." He shot up immediately, his body tense like a coiled spring. The half-full cup of coffee was abandoned on the side table, forgotten. "Yes? Any news?" "The surgery began about 15 minutes ago. So far, everything is proceeding as expected, considering the severity of the case. Dr. Reed specifically asked me to let you know, and said she will keep you informed of any significant changes." Alan felt a slight sense of relief, but knew it was too early to let his guard down. "How long will it take?" "It's hard to say precisely with an emergency C-section like this. It could be between 30 minutes and an hour, maybe longer depending on how things evolve, if there are additional complications or bleeding that needs to be controlled. But you will be notified as soon as it's over, and if there are any major changes during the procedure, someone will come inform you immediately. Would you like anything? Water, tea, something to eat?" "No, thank you. I just want my daughter to be okay." The nurse smiled with genuine understanding, the kind of smile that comes from someone used to dealing with families in crisis. "Dr. Reed is one of the best obstetricians in New York. Your daughter is in excellent hands. You can rest assured of that." He thanked her with a nod, and the nurse left quietly, closing the door behind her. Alan sat back down, leaving the half-empty coffee cup on the side table, the liquid already cooling and forming a thin film on the surface. He put his elbows on his knees and rested his face in his large, calloused hands, the same hands that had held his service weapon for so many years, that had arrested criminals, that had comforted victims, that had hugged his daughter at every important moment of her life. He finally allowed the tears he had been holding back since that devastating phone call to stream freely down his aged face, marked by time and experience. "Cecilia," he whispered to the wife who was long gone but still lived in every beat of his heart, in every decision he made, in every moment of loneliness he faced. Our little girl needs you now more than ever. I know you're out there somewhere, watching over her like you always did. Protect her and our little grandson, our Michael. Please, my love, don't let me lose her too. I can't bear to lose anyone else I love." The words came out broken, half-whispered, half-prayed, a one-sided conversation with someone who could no longer answer, but whose presence he still felt in some inexplicable way. Alan wasn't particularly religious, never a regular churchgoer, but in moments like this, when human powerlessness became so painfully obvious, it was hard not to seek comfort in something greater, something beyond logical and rational understanding. Across town, in a completely different world, at the restaurant Daniel, which continued its elegant, uninterrupted service, Richard had finally asked for the check. The watch on his wrist, a Rolex Submariner that had cost him over $10,000, read 10:15 p.m. It was getting late, and even he, with all his ability to ignore inconvenient situations, was starting to feel slightly uneasy about everything that had happened. His phone, which remained screen down on the table, as if that could make it cease to exist, had rung 3 more times since that first call from Madison. Always numbers with the hospital's prefix, always ignored with the press of a button that sent the calls straight to a voicemail he never checked. Jessica was visibly different now. The charm and seduction from the beginning of the evening had evaporated like water under a scorching midday sun. She was quieter, her eyes avoiding his, fiddling distractedly with the linen napkin on the table. The wine that had once made her relaxed, and Smiley now just made her drowsy and pensive, lost in thoughts that were likely anything but comfortable. The reality of the situation was beginning to penetrate the fantasy bubble they had built over the past few weeks. "Don't you think you should go see how she is?" Jessica finally asked, breaking the awkward, heavy silence that had settled between them over the last half hour. Her voice was low, almost hesitant, as if she feared the answer but needed to ask anyway. Richard shrugged with a practiced indifference as he swiped his black credit card, the one with no limit, a symbol of status. Through the machine, the waiter brought on a silver tray. If it were really serious, they would have insisted more. Hospitals have protocols. They need to cover themselves legally. They called 5 times, Richard. There was something new in Jessica's tone now. It was no longer admiration, no longer complicity. It was something close to disapproval. Hospitals always exaggerate to protect themselves from lawsuits. They need to document that they tried to make contact, you see. If they don't call and something happens, they can be sued for medical negligence. It's just administrative protocol, standard procedure. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a real emergency. He entered his PIN with precise movements, not looking at Jessica as he spoke, as if explaining something obvious to someone who simply didn't understand how the world worked. Jessica looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, even though he prided himself on reading people. There was something between disappointment, disgust, and maybe even a little fear in her eyes, as if she was seeing for the first time who the man in front of her really was, beyond the facade of charm and money. And what she saw clearly, that did not please her. But she said nothing more. She just picked up her expensive designer leather bag, which she had bought with her last quarterly bonus, and stood up when he did the same, smoothing her black dress and avoiding his gaze. They left the restaurant together, but the atmosphere between them had completely changed. The evening's charm had dissolved like sugar in hot water. On the sidewalk, Richard offered her a ride, but Jessica politely declined. "I'll grab a cab. I think it's better." "Are you sure I can drop you off?" "I'm sure." She hesitated, then added, in a low voice, "You should go see your family, Richard." "Really?" He forced a smile. "I'll stop by in a bit, after I drop you off." But Jessica was already hailing a passing taxi. She got in without looking back, leaving Richard alone on the busy Upper East Side sidewalk. He stood there for a few moments, hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, watching the traffic go by. Then he took out his own phone and checked the missed calls. 5 in total, all from the hospital. He sighed, more irritated than worried, and decided that maybe he should go there. Not because he was genuinely concerned, but because if he didn't, Madison would probably make a scene later. He walked to where he had left his black BMW X5 with the valet. He paid a generous tip and got into the car, adjusting the seat and mirrors. He turned on the GPS and typed in the address for Mount Sinai Hospital. The device calculated the route, 28 minutes with the current traffic. Richard turned on the car stereo, a playlist of smooth jazz, and started driving without any rush. He was convinced that when he arrived at the hospital, he would find Madison complaining of pain, but essentially fine, as always. She had always been dramatic, in his opinion. She turned minor problems into monumental crises. As he drove down Park Avenue, he had no idea what awaited him. He had no idea that at that very moment, his partner was on an operating table, fighting for her life while a team of professionals worked to save her and their son. In the operating room at Mount Sinai, under the intense, shadowless white lights, Dr. Reed worked with the surgical precision and confidence that only come from decades of experience in life-or-death situations. Her gloved hands moved swiftly, but without unnecessary haste. Each incision calculated to the millimeter, each movement executed with the technical perfection acquired over thousands of similar procedures throughout her career. She knew this territory like a pilot knows their route. She could navigate it with her eyes closed. But she never let her guard down, never assumed she knew everything, because every patient was unique, every body reacted differently, every surgery had its own surprises waiting to emerge. Around her, the surgical team functioned like a perfectly oiled and synchronized machine, each professional fulfilling their role with quiet, focused efficiency. The anesthesiologist, a man in his early 40s with thin-rimmed glasses, sat by Madison's head, his eyes fixed on the monitors that blinked numbers and traced graphs in green and red against dark screens. Every heartbeat, every breath, every millimeter of blood pressure was monitored with obsessive attention. The scrub nurse, a veteran of countless surgeries, anticipated Dr. Reed's every need, passing instruments before they were even requested, her movements as economical and precise as a dancer's. The assistants kept the surgical field clean and visible, suctioning blood, adjusting lights, ensuring nothing obstructed the main work. "Pressure's rising again," the anesthesiologist announced in a calm but alert tone, his eyes on the monitors displaying worrying numbers. 180 over 110, and still climbing. "Increase the magnesium sulfate," Reed ordered without looking away from the surgical field, her hands continuing the methodical work of opening the tissues. "And let me know immediately if it goes past 190. We need to get this under control before we deliver the baby." Increasing to 4 grams per hour, the anesthesiologist adjusted the infusion pump, his fingers flying over the digital controls. Maternal heart rate at 120, saturation at 96%. Reed made the final incision in Madison's distended uterus, that critical, delicate moment when everything can go right or terribly wrong, when years of training and instinct meet in a fraction of a second. Warm, bright red blood gushed from the incision, more than there should have been, but still within the expected range for such a case. She worked quickly but with extreme care, her experienced hands reaching into the uterine cavity and finding the baby. She felt the small form under her fingers. She pulled gently but firmly, supporting the fragile head, guiding the tiny body out. And then, there he was. Michael, too small, premature, his skin a purplish hue and frighteningly silent. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. "Baby's out," Reed announced, her voice maintaining its professional tone despite the concern she felt, quickly clamping the thick, pulsating umbilical cord, as a nurse snipped it with surgical scissors and immediately carried Michael to the neonatal resuscitation table, specially prepared and set up next to the operating table. "How is he? I need an APGAR score." The neonatal team, consisting of 3 specialists, was already working with quiet, efficient urgency, their hands flying over the small body, drying the baby with soft, warm cloths, stimulating the soles of his feet and his back, carefully suctioning his airways with a thin tube to remove secretions. The seconds felt like eternities, each one stretching like a rubber band. The silence in the room was heavy, oppressive. Everyone held their breath, waiting, hoping. And then, finally, a cry. Faint, almost like a kitten's meow, but a cry. A sign of life. Michael was crying. He was alive and fighting. "Apgar 5 at 1 minute," said the neonatologist, a young woman with a firm voice, mentally noting every aspect of the newborn's clinical picture. "Heart rate 120. He's breathing spontaneously. Reasonable muscle tone. Color is improving. We'll keep him under observation, but the initial prognosis is positive." A collective sigh of relief permeated the operating room, visible in the almost imperceptible relaxation of each professional's shoulders. But it was no time to celebrate or let their guard down. The baby was alive, but there was still another life at stake. Reed turned her full attention back to Madison lying before her. The bleeding was too intense, far more intense than it should be at this stage of the procedure, far too intense. "I need more lap sponges now," Reed said, her voice calm but with an underlying urgency that everyone in the room recognized. "And prep oxytocin and misoprostol. We're going to have to work fast here to control this hemorrhage before it gets out of hand." The next 2 hours were an intense, relentless battle against time, against a body that seemed determined to give up, against the limitations of medicine, even in its most advanced form. Reed fought with every fiber of her being, with every ounce of knowledge accumulated over 23 years of medical practice. She sutured bleeding vessels one by one with the patience of an artisan. She staunched points of hemorrhage that appeared in unexpected places. She controlled the blood pressure that rose and fell like a dangerous roller coaster. She medicated, adjusted, improvised when necessary. And slowly, millimeter by painful millimeter, inch by inch, won with sweat and determination, she brought Madison back from the brink of the abyss. She brought her patient back to life. The team worked in absolute synchrony, each member anticipating needs, each playing their part without the need for words. The anesthesiologist adjusted medications, monitored vital signs. That fluctuated dangerously and kept Madison sedated and intubated. The nurses changed instruments, cleaned the surgical field that repeatedly became soaked with blood, and prepared medications. The minutes turned into hours as they fought together for that life. When she finally left the operating room, it was past midnight. The clock on the hallway wall read 12:43 a.m., Friday, a new day that Madison had almost not lived to see. Reed was physically and emotionally exhausted, her white coat stained with blood despite the disposable surgical gown she had worn, her hair damp with sweat under the cap she had now removed, but there was a faint smile of satisfaction and relief on her tired face. The kind of smile that comes when you win a battle that seemed lost. Alan stood up immediately when he saw her approaching down the hall, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. He had spent the last few hours in silent agony, pacing the small waiting room like a caged animal, unable to sit for more than 5 minutes at a time, unable to think of anything but his daughter fighting for her life just a few feet away. "Doctor," his voice came out hoarse, thick with restrained emotion. Reed approached and placed a gentle but firm hand on his arm. "She's alive, Mr. Hayes. They're both alive," she said simply, without unnecessary frills, and watched as the strong man in front of her nearly buckled with sheer relief. He leaned against the wall, a hand over his heart, his eyes filling with tears. "It was tough, very tough," Reed continued, her voice honest but kind. "Your daughter lost a lot of blood during and after the delivery. We had to work hard to control the hemorrhage. She'll need intensive care for the next few hours, possibly the next few days. We'll be monitoring everything closely: blood pressure, kidney function, coagulation. But she's strong. She fought hard. The baby was born premature, weighing only 4 pounds and 10 ounces, but he's breathing on his own without the need for mechanical ventilation, which is an excellent sign given his prematurity. He'll be in the NICU for observation as a precaution, likely for a few weeks until he gains weight and his lungs develop more." Alan couldn't speak. The words were stuck in his throat, blocked by tears that were finally of relief and not fear. He just nodded repeatedly, processing every word the doctor said, absorbing and carefully storing each piece of information. "You saved their lives by coming to sign those papers when you did," Reed continued, her voice softer now, almost maternal. "If we had waited another 15, maybe 20 minutes for authorization, if we hadn't started the procedure when we did, I don't know if I'd be giving you this positive news right now. The timing was absolutely critical. Every minute counted. When can I see her? Alan finally found his voice, though it came out weak and trembling. She's being transferred to the ICU right now. She's still under the effects of anesthesia and sedation. Her body needs to rest to recover from the surgical trauma and blood loss. In a few hours, once she's fully stabilized and her vital signs are stronger, you can see her for a few minutes. We have controlled visiting hours in the ICU to prevent infections and allow patients to rest properly. You can see the baby sooner in the NICU. There's an area with glass windows where family members can observe the newborns. I can have someone take you there if you'd like. Alan finally found the strength to say more than a few words. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much for saving my daughter, for saving my grandson. I don't have enough words to express my gratitude. You've given me back the only family I have. It's all I have left in this world. Reed squeezed his shoulder firmly, a gesture of understanding and empathy that went beyond the doctor-patient relationship. It's my job, Mr. Hayes, and I love my job precisely for nights like this, when we can bring people back when all seemed lost, when we can make the difference between life and loss. She paused, her face taking on a more serious expression. Has the baby's father arrived? No. The word came out sharp, laden with bitterness and contained anger. I see. There was a world of meaning in that single phrase. Understanding, disapproval, restrained indignation. Reed had seen a lot in her career, but she never got used to this kind of abandonment. Well, I'm going to change, grab a strong coffee, and then I'll stop by the ICU to see how she's progressing in the first few hours post-op. If there are any changes in her condition, anything at all, the team will notify me immediately and I'll come speak with you. She walked away down the hall, her steps tired but still firm, a woman who had just saved 2 lives and would likely save many more before she could finally rest. Alan watched her go, then sank back into the waiting room chair, finally allowing the overwhelming relief to envelop him completely like a warm blanket. His hands were shaking. His heart was still beating too fast. But his daughter was alive, his grandson was alive, that was all that mattered right now. Everything else, all the anger he felt, all the indignation, all the need for justice, could wait. It could wait until Madison was safe and recovered. But it wouldn't wait for long. Because Alan Hayes wasn't just a loving, worried father. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to seeking justice and truth, to exposing lies and bringing to light what was hidden in the shadows. And what had happened that night, the cowardly and cruel abandonment his daughter had suffered in her moment of greatest need and vulnerability, when she and the child she carried had nearly lost their lives, would not go unpunished. He would make sure of it. Not with physical violence, not with personal revenge, but with something far more powerful and far more devastating, with the raw, unvarnished truth. And the truth, as he had learned over so many years of criminal investigation, in so many cases he had closed, with so many criminals he had helped put behind bars, always came to light. It always found its way into the open. No matter how long it took, no matter how many people tried to hide or distort it, the truth had a life of its own, and this time he would be the instrument that brought it into the world. Richard Sterling parked his black BMW X5 in the underground garage of Mount Sinai Hospital at 2:15 on Friday morning. The car's digital clock marked the exact time as he turned off the engine, and for a brief moment he sat there in the dim, fluorescent-lit garage, just listening to the silence that fell when the music stopped. He had taken longer than the GPS predicted, stopping at a gas station on the way to buy gum and check some non-urgent emails. He used as an excuse to delay the inevitable. There was no rush in his mind, none of the urgency that should consume a man whose child was being born, whose partner was in danger. After all, if it were really serious, they would have kept calling, insisting more vehemently. The silence of the past few hours, interpreted through the convenient filter of his own denial, had convinced him that his initial assessment was correct. Madison was just being dramatic, as he always thought she was. He walked unhurriedly through the lit garage, past rows of parked cars, the souls, of his Italian leather shoes echoing against the cold, polished concrete. There was something surreal about being there at that hour of the morning, when the world seemed suspended between the dying night and the unborn day. He took the elevator to the ground floor, pressing the button with his index finger, while checking his phone one more time. No new message from Jessica, no recent missed calls. Everything seemed strangely calm, almost normal, and that reassured him in a twisted way. He entered the empty hospital lobby, where only a few night shift employees moved silently like ghosts with specific purposes. The lighting was softer than during the day, creating an almost contemplative atmosphere. A middle-aged man was dozing on one of the sofas, probably waiting for news of a family member. A young woman walked slowly down the hall, pushing an IV pole, her steps slow and careful. Life went on, even in the dead of night. Richard approached the information desk, where a different receptionist from the one who had helped Alan hours earlier was typing on a computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard with mechanical efficiency. She looked up as he approached, a professional but tired smile forming on her face. "Good evening, I'm looking for a patient, Madison Hayes. She was admitted earlier." The receptionist typed the name into the system, her eyes scanning the screen. When she found the record, her expression subtly changed. "Sir, Miss Hayes is in the ICU. Are you family?" "I'm the baby's father," Richard said with a certain automatic pride, as if it were an important credential. The receptionist studied him for a moment, and there was something in her gaze he couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't admiration. It was something close to disapproval. "The ICU is on the 5th floor, but visiting hours are restricted. You'll need to speak with the nursing staff up there." Richard thanked her with a nod and headed for the elevators. As he rode up, he checked his phone again. A few work notifications, a message from Jessica saying only, "I hope she's okay, nothing major." He put the phone in his pocket as the doors opened on the 5th floor. The hallway was quiet, lit by softer lights than during the day. There was an atmosphere of respectful stillness, the kind of silence found in hospitals in the early morning, when life slows down but never completely stops. Richard followed the signs to the ICU nurses' station. A middle-aged nurse, the same one who had spoken with Alan hours before, looked up as he approached. Her face took on a neutral, professional expression, but there was something icy behind the mask of courtesy. "Good evening, may I help you?" "I'm here to see Madison Hayes. I'm Richard Sterling, the baby's father." The nurse stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Sterling, how nice of you to finally make it." There was a subtle irony in her tone that he chose to ignore. "I had unavoidable commitments. How is she?" "Your partner underwent an extremely serious emergency surgery a few hours ago. She almost didn't survive. The baby, either. Both are in delicate but stable condition at the moment." Each word was pronounced with deliberate emphasis. Richard blinked, processing the information. "Surgery? But I thought it was just normal labor. Did she exaggerate that much?" The nurse closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath to maintain her professional composure. "Sir, your partner had severe preeclampsia, with a major hemorrhage. She called you for help, and you refused to come. She collapsed, alone at home, and had to be brought in by an ambulance. If her father hadn't arrived in time to authorize the surgery, we would likely be having a very different conversation right now." "I didn't know it was that serious," Richard defended himself, a pang of discomfort starting to grow in his stomach. "She always complains about everything. How was I supposed to know this time was for real?" The nurse looked at him with an expression that mixed disbelief and thinly veiled contempt. "The hospital called you 5 times to inform you of the gravity of the situation, and you either didn't answer or hung up every time. The 911 dispatch has a recording of your partner begging for help." Richard felt the floor shift slightly beneath his feet. "A recording? Can I see her?" "She's still under sedation. Her father has been in the waiting room for hours. Perhaps you'd like to speak with him first." "Her father is here." Richard couldn't hide the apprehension that crept into his voice, making it sound slightly shaky. Alan had never liked him. That had always been crystal clear, obvious in every glance, in every tense conversation during Forced Sunday. Lunches in every silence heavy with judgment. The old ex-cop had a way of looking at people, as if he could read their deepest secrets, as if he could see through their carefully constructed masks. And now, with everything that had happened, with his daughter nearly dying while Richard was calmly dining with another woman, well, Richard didn't need to be a detective to imagine what awaited him. "Waiting room, end of the hall to your right. You can't miss it," the nurse said, and there was an almost warning tone in her voice, as if she were saying, "Good luck, you're going to need it." Richard thanked her with a nod that tried to seem confident, but came out only as anxious, and walked in the indicated direction, his steps slower now, each one seeming to bring him closer to a judgment he didn't want to face. His hands were slightly damp with sweat, something that rarely happened. He was a man accustomed to tough negotiations, to tense meetings with demanding investors, to presentations for ruthless executives. But none of that, absolutely nothing in his professional experience had prepared him to face the father of a woman he had abandoned in her hour of greatest need. When he reached the small waiting room, he immediately saw Alan's figure sitting near the large window, his body leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his tired face illuminated by the soft growing light of dawn that was beginning to timidly brighten the sky outside, painting it in shades of pink and orange. The older man looked up when he heard Richard's footsteps, and the look he gave was like burning ice, cold and searing at the same time, filled with an intensity that made Richard take an involuntary step back. "You." The word came out in a low, controlled, dangerously calm tone, but it was so charged with emotion that it practically vibrated in the air between them. It was the kind of calm that precedes devastating storms. "Alan, I came as soon as I could assess the situation." Richard tried to sound casual, controlled, but his voice betrayed his discomfort. "How's Madison? Have the doctors given any more detailed news?" Alan stood up slowly, his 62 years seeming to weigh on his broad shoulders that still held the military posture of decades past, but there was a contained strength in his body that was still intimidating, a physical presence that filled the space around him. He wasn't a tall man, but at that moment he seemed immense. "As soon as you could," he repeated, his voice rising slightly in volume and intensity. "As soon as you could assess the situation. The hospital called you at 8:30 last night. It's now 2:30 in the morning. It took you 6 hours to come check if the mother of your child is alive or dead." 6 hours? "I was in an important business meeting. I couldn't leave immediately." "A business meeting?" Alan took a step toward him, his fists clenched at his sides. "My daughter was on the floor of her living room, bleeding, begging for help, and you were in a business meeting. She called you, and you called her dramatic and hung up on her." "How do you know that?" Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "Because I know my daughter. Because the nurse told me what you said when they called. And because when she wakes up, if she wants to tell me, I will listen to every word." Alan took another step. "You abandoned my pregnant daughter in a medical emergency. You ignored calls from the hospital while she was fighting for her life. Where were you, Richard? Where were you that was more important than the life of the woman carrying your child?" Richard backed away involuntarily. "I didn't know it was that serious. I swear, if I had known—" "If you had known," Alan interrupted, his voice now trembling with barely contained rage. "They told you. The hospital told you. She told you. You just chose not to believe it, because it was inconvenient for you, because you had more interesting plans for the evening. Look, I understand you're upset, but—" "Upset?" Alan laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Upset is when someone forgets your birthday. Upset is when someone is late for dinner. What I'm feeling right now doesn't have a name. My daughter almost died. My grandson almost died. And you couldn't even be bothered to answer the phone." Richard had no answer. For the first time in many years, he was completely speechless, without arguments, without excuses that sounded even remotely convincing. The heavy silence between them was broken by the arrival of Dr. Reed. "Mr. Hayes?" She entered the room, immediately sensing the tension. She looked from Alan to Richard, connecting the dots. "Is this the baby's father?" "It is," Alan said, his voice dry. Reed studied Richard for a moment. "Your partner is starting to wake up from the sedation. She'll be confused, disoriented. Mr. Hayes can see her first for just a few minutes. Then, if she's willing, other visitors can enter. But I need to be clear. She has been through severe physical and emotional trauma. Anything that upsets her could affect her recovery. So I ask that everyone remain calm and respectful of the patient's well-being. The warning was clearly directed at both of them, but her gaze lingered on Richard. Alan nodded and followed the doctor out of the room. Richard was left alone, sinking heavily into one of the chairs, his head in his hands. Everything was unraveling in a way he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. In the ICU room, in a sterile environment lit by soft lights and surrounded by the constant beeping of monitors, Madison slowly began to emerge from the thick, suffocating fog of anesthesia that had kept her unconscious for hours. Everything seemed distant, blurry, disconnected from reality, as if she were underwater, trying to swim to the surface but never quite reaching it. She heard muffled sounds, voices that seemed to come from far away, and sensed presences around her, but couldn't fully process what was happening. Her body felt like it didn't belong to her, heavy and distant, responding with frustrating slowness to her brain's commands as it struggled to regain control. Her eyes opened with difficulty, her eyelids feeling like they weighed a ton. The room's light seeming overly bright and invasive, even though it was deliberately soft. It took a few long, confusing seconds for her vision to focus, for the blurry shapes around her to gain definition and meaning. There were tubes coming out of her arms, wires connected to her body, machines around her blinking and emitting rhythmic sounds. The sound of the heart monitors marking each beat, the whisper of the air conditioning, the distant noise of hospital activity from the hallway. "Easy, honey, easy. It's okay now. You're safe." It was her father's voice, that deep, steady voice that was like an anchor in the storm of confusion. She would know that voice anywhere, in any situation, in any state of consciousness. The voice that had rocked her to sleep as a baby, that had comforted her when she lost her mother as a teenager, and the world seemed to fall apart, that had always been there at the most important, most difficult, most decisive moments of her life, the voice that had never abandoned her. "Dad?" Her own voice came out weak, hoarse, scraping her dry throat, almost unrecognizable to her own ears. It sounded like a stranger's voice. "I'm here, honey. I'm here." Alan held her hand carefully, avoiding the tubes and needles. "You're in the hospital. You had surgery, but everything's okay now. You're safe." The memories started coming back in fragments. The pain, the blood, the phone, Richard hanging up, the cold floor, the ambulance. "Michael," she whispered, one hand instinctively going to her belly, which was now empty. Only pain where there had once been life. "Michael's okay. Your son is alive and in the NICU. He's a fighter, like his mum. Small, but strong. The doctors say he's going to be fine." Tears began to stream down Madison's face, mixing with the sweat and moisture on her pale skin. I thought I was going to lose him. I thought I was going to die." "You almost did. You both almost—" Alan couldn't finish the sentence. "But you didn't. You're here. You're alive. That's what matters." "Richard." The name came out as a question, a plea, an accusation, all at once. Alan hesitated. Was it too soon? Was she strong enough to know? But he had never lied to his daughter, and he wasn't about to start now. "He got here a little while ago. He's at the hospital." He came. There was a pathetic relief in those two words that broke Alan's heart. 6 hours later, Madison. He arrived 6 hours later." His voice was harsher than he intended. Madison closed her eyes, processing the information. 6 hours. While she was fighting for her life, while her son was being born prematurely, while everything was falling apart. 6 hours. Where was he? Alan didn't answer immediately. He didn't know for sure, had no concrete proof, only suspicions based on decades of experience reading people and situations. But he didn't need to speculate. The facts alone were damning enough. "I don't know where he was, but I know he wasn't where. He was supposed to be, by your side. Dr. Reed entered the room, checking the monitors and making notes on her tablet. Madison, I'm Dr. Helen Reed. I performed your surgery. How are you feeling? Confused, in pain, tired. That's completely normal. You went through an extensive procedure and lost a lot of blood. You'll need time to recover fully. But the worst is over. You and your son are safe now. Can I see him? Can I see Michael? Not just yet. You need to get a little stronger, but as soon as it's possible, we'll take you in. A wheelchair to the NICU to see your son through the glass. For now, I brought you this. She held up a small tablet and showed a photo. It was Michael, tiny in an incubator, surrounded by wires and tubes, but visibly breathing, visibly alive. Madison sobbed at the sight of the image. Her son, her baby, so small, so fragile, but there, existing, fighting. He's perfect. He's a warrior, just like his mother. Helen smiled gently. Now, there's someone here who would like to see you, the baby's father. But only if you want him to, if you'd rather. Wait, that's your right. Madison looked at her father, who maintained a carefully neutral expression, though his eyes said everything. She knew Alan had disapproved of Richard from the beginning. She had always known. But she had chosen to ignore it, chosen to believe that love would be enough. Now lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that were keeping her alive, with her son born prematurely because of stress that could have been avoided, she began to question all those choices. You can let him in, she said finally, her voice weak but firm. She needed to face him. She needed to hear what he had to say. She needed to look into the eyes of the man who had abandoned her and understand why. Alan squeezed her hand one last time. I'll be right outside. Anything at all, you call me. Understand? There was a warning in those words, not for her, but for Richard. Madison nodded. Alan stood up, gave his daughter one last protective look, and left the room, passing Richard in the hallway without a word, only a look that promised consequences if he hurt his daughter again. Richard entered the room slowly, almost hesitantly. When he saw Madison in the bed, pale, surrounded by machines, with tubes in her veins and monitors blinking beside her, he felt a tightness in his chest he hadn't expected. She looked so fragile, so different from the woman he knew. He approached the bed. Maddie, he began, but she raised a weak hand, stopping him. No, not now. Just sit there and let me look at you for a minute. He obeyed, sitting in the chair Alan had occupied moments before. Madison studied him in silence. She saw the expensive suit still impeccable despite the hour. She saw the leather shoes that shone even in the soft light of the room. She saw the perfectly styled hair, the clean-shaven face, the expensive watch on his wrist. Everything about him screamed success, control, superficial perfection. And suddenly, seeing him there after everything she had been through, she felt a sharp clarity cut through the fog of medication. "Where were you?" she asked finally, her voice low but carrying a weight that made each word feel like an accusation, a judgment, a sentence. Richard opened his mouth to answer, closed it again and reconsidered his words. He knew that anything he said could be used against him, that any excuse would sound hollow given the gravity of what had happened. "I was at dinner. It was a business meeting I couldn't cancel. You know how important these things are for the company, for our future." "You were at dinner," she repeated, letting the words hang in the air between them, heavy as lead, letting them echo in the silence of the room until their full, cruel meaning was revealed. "While I was on the floor of our living room, bleeding, desperate, begging for help, thinking I was going to die, that our son was going to die, you were sitting comfortably in a restaurant having dinner, eating expensive food while I was crawling on the floor trying to reach the phone. I didn't know it was that serious, Maddie. You have to understand, you've always been very sensitive about these things. You've always had a tendency to—" "Always what?" she interrupted, her voice gaining strength despite her physical weakness, a strength born of anger and pain, and the painful realization of someone finally seeing the truth without the filter of blind love. "Always been dramatic? always exaggerated my pain, always turned small problems into major crises. Is that what you were going to say? Is that how you justify ignoring a pregnant woman begging for help? He didn't answer immediately, and in that hesitant silence, Madison found more truth than in any words he could have said. The silence was answer enough, a full confession. I called you. I begged you to come get me, to help me, to take me to the hospital. I told you I was bleeding, that there was so much blood, that I couldn't get up off the floor, that I desperately needed help. And you know what you told me? You told me I was exaggerating. You told me all pregnant women go through this. You told me to take a warm bath, drink some chamomile tea, and lie down, as if it were just menstrual cramps, as if our son wasn't dying inside me. And then you hung up on me. You just hung up. Maddie, I'm so sorry. I passed out on the cold floor of our living room, alone, completely alone in a huge, empty house. Do you know what my last conscious thought was before everything went dark? Before I lost consciousness thinking I would never wake up again. Do you know what went through my mind in that moment? Her tears were flowing freely now, soaking the white hospital pillow. That I was going to die there. That our son was going to die. That you didn't care. That to you a business dinner was more important than the life of the woman you claimed to love, than the life of the son you helped create. I was there. I'm here now, aren't I? I came as soon as I realized the gravity. 6 hours. Later, Richard, 6 long hours. While I was on an operating table with doctors fighting to keep me alive to save our baby, where were you? What were you doing? Having a quiet dinner? Laughing? Drinking expensive wine? With whom, Richard? Who were you with that was so important? His silence was deafening, louder than any scream. Madison saw the hesitation in his eyes, the guilt he tried to hide behind a mask of feigned concern, and in that moment she knew. She just knew with a sharp clarity that cut through the fog of medication. Maybe she had always known deep in her heart where she kept the truth she was afraid to face. Maybe she just hadn't wanted to see, because seeing would mean having to act, having to acknowledge that her life was a carefully constructed lie. Who were you with, Richard? And don't lie to me, not now, not after everything I've been through. I deserve at least the truth. It was just a work meeting, nothing more. He tried again, but his voice lacked conviction. Who were you with? The scream came out with a force she didn't know she had, making the monitors beside her beep faster. Jessica Morgan, you know her. She works in PR for one of my companies. Madison closed her eyes. Jessica, young, beautiful, ambitious. Of course it was her. You're having an affair. No, it's not like that. It was just a business dinner. Don't lie to me, not now, not after everything. At least give me that, the truth. Richard was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Madison found her answer. She didn't need words. The truth was there, raw and painful in the air between them. Get out, she said finally, her voice broken but firm. Get out now. Maddie, let's talk about this when you're feeling better. Get out! The scream came out with a force she didn't know she still had, making the monitors beep faster, warning of her rising blood pressure. Get out of my room, get out of my life. I almost died, Richard. Our son almost died, and you were having dinner with your mistress. Get out, now. The door burst open, and Alan stormed in like a hurricane, followed by Dr. Reed. What's going on in here? He was just leaving, Madison said, tears streaming. Freely now. He was leaving, and he's not coming back. Helen checked the monitors, then shot a stern look at Richard. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The patient is under my care, and your presence is causing stress that could compromise her recovery. Richard stood up, completely lost. Everything had spun out of his control. Maddie, please. Never again, she whispered, turning her face away, refusing to look at him. I never want to see you again. I never want to hear your voice again. You made your choice that night, now I'm making mine. Get out! Alan took a step toward Richard, his intimidating presence speaking louder than any words. Richard backed away, leaving the room without looking back, his hurried footsteps echoing down the empty hall. When the door closed, Madison finally broke down completely, her sobs shaking her bruised body as Alan held her carefully, murmuring words of comfort as he did when she was little and woke up from nightmares. But this time, the nightmare was real, and there was no waking up from it. Dr. Reed adjusted the medication to calm Madison, then quietly left the room, leaving father and daughter alone with their shared pain. Outside, in the empty pre-dawn hallway, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. In so many years of medicine, she had seen a lot, but some stories still affected her. Some wounds were deeper than any scalpel could reach, and as the sun began to rise over New York, casting its first golden rays over the waking city, inside that hospital, a woman began the long, painful process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but it would be hers on her own terms, with her own strength. And this time she wouldn't be alone. She had her father, she had her son, and she had herself. And in the end, she would discover that had always been enough. The days that followed that devastating night unfolded at a slow, painful pace, like wounds healing millimeter by millimeter, leaving scars that would never completely fade. Madison remained in the ICU for 5 days, her body fighting to recover from the physical trauma, while her mind tried to process the emotional trauma that was, in many ways, deeper and more cutting than any scalpel. She no longer cried. The tears had dried up after that first night, after she threw Richard out of her room and her life. In their place was a cold, crystalline determination that her father recognized immediately. It was the same expression he saw in the mirror decades ago, when he decided a case would not go unsolved, no matter how long it took. Michael remained in the NICU, 1 floor below, small, fragile, but a fighter. Each day he gained a few precious ounces, his lungs grew stronger, his tiny body learned to exist outside the womb that had protected him for 7.5 months. Madison was taken in a wheelchair to see him on the 3rd day, and when she placed her hand on the incubator, feeling the warmth of the life that was almost lost, something inside her realigned. It was no longer just about her. It had never been just about her. It was about this small, perfect human being who depended on her to survive, to grow, to have a chance in this world. And she would not let him down, not like his father had. Alan spent nearly all his time at the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, eating sandwiches from the cafeteria, refusing to go home no matter how much Madison insisted he needed to rest. But beyond caring for his daughter and getting to know his grandson, Alan had another purpose. His detective's mind, sharpened by decades of experience, was at work. He started discreetly, talking to nurses, paramedics, reception staff. Small questions here and there, a casual interest that hid a much more serious intent. That's how he obtained access to the recording of the 911 call Madison had made that terrible night. The emergency services kept detailed, meticulous records of all calls for legal and quality control purposes, files that could be crucial in future investigations or lawsuits. Alan, using his old police contacts, people he had worked alongside for decades, chasing criminals and solving impossible cases, managed to get an official copy of the recording. When he listened to it for the first time, alone in an empty hospital room late at night, when the hallways were quiet and only the distant sound of medical monitors echoed off the walls, he had to sit down and hold his head in his large, trembling hands. His daughter's voice, desperate, breathless, broken by physical pain and fear, interrupted by sharp moans of agony that no father should ever have to hear, pleading for help with a heart-wrenching vulnerability, telling the operator there was so much blood, describing details that made his stomach turn, asking in a small, frightened voice if the baby would survive, if she was losing her son. And then, that final devastating phrase before she passed out, the words coming out faint and almost inaudible, "Save my baby," her voice breaking, weak, defeated, a mother's last desperate plea before losing consciousness. Alan listened to the recording 3 times in a row, each time feeling the rage build inside him like a fire being fed by gallons of gasoline. But it wasn't uncontrolled rage, not blind fury. It was focused, directed, calculated anger, the kind that moves mountains, topples empires, and seeks justice with surgical precision. He also discovered something interesting while talking to the paramedics who had treated Madison. They mentioned that the ambulance, on its way to the hospital, had passed by the street where Daniel was located. It was the standard route from the Upper East Side to Mount Sinai. Alan mentally filed that information away. Then came the first major breakthrough that would change everything. A neighbor of Madison's, a 70-year-old woman named Mrs. Peterson, who lived 3 houses down on the same tree-lined street, showed up at the hospital on the 4th day after the surgery. She had seen the intense activity of the paramedics that night, which had shattered the usual quiet of the upscale neighborhood. The blaring siren of the ambulance cutting through the peace, the red and blue lights illuminating the normally tranquil street like an out-of-place fireworks display. Naturally curious and genuinely concerned for the young neighbor who always greeted her politely, she had taken out her phone and recorded a video from a distance, from the safety of her own porch, thinking she might show it to the Homeowners Association as a concrete example of the importance of having nearby medical security and rapid emergency response. The video, though recorded from a distance and with the limited quality of a cell phone held by shaky, elderly hands, showed the scene with enough clarity to leave no doubt. The paramedics rushing into Madison's house carrying heavy medical equipment, their movements indicating extreme urgency, the door being forced open because no one answered, because the homeowner was too unconscious to open it, because every second counted. Crucial minutes later, the scene no one would forget. Madison being carried out on a stretcher, clearly unconscious, pale as a ghost even in the artificial light, connected to beeping and flashing machines, the paramedics literally running with the stretcher toward the ambulance. There was no denying the gravity of the situation. There was no way to look at those images and say it was an exaggeration, drama, or a pregnant woman's anxiety. Here was the visual, documented proof with a digital timestamp showing the exact date and time embedded in the file's metadata. 9:12 p.m. on a Thursday in October, exactly when Richard was dining peacefully with his mistress a few miles away, drinking expensive wine and planning romantic getaways. Alan thanked Mrs. Peterson and asked for a copy of the video. The woman, outraged when she heard the full story, not only gave him a copy, but also offered to testify to whatever was needed. "That man doesn't deserve that girl," she said, shaking her head in disapproval. "My late husband, when I had complications with our first child, didn't leave my side even to go to the bathroom. Now that was a real man." The pieces were falling into place, but Alan knew he needed more. He needed to establish not only that Richard had abandoned Madison, but also that he had tried to cover up the truth, to manipulate the narrative. And that's when luck, or perhaps cosmic justice, intervened. Jessica Morgan began having intense, disturbing nightmares that woke her up in the middle of the night, sweaty and trembling. Since that night at Daniel, since the reality of what had happened began to seep into her conscience, she couldn't sleep properly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's pale face when he received the insistent calls from the hospital, saw the irritation in his eyes instead of the concern that should have been there. She heard his words again, those dismissive, annoyed words that echoed in her mind like a broken record. She's being dramatic again. She remembered with painful clarity the cynical, cruel smile when he said Madison always exaggerated everything, that it was nothing serious, and then, inevitably, in the silent hours of the morning when the guilt became unbearable, she imagined the scene she hadn't witnessed, but that her mind reconstructed with vivid, terrible detail. A pregnant woman alone in a huge, empty house, crawling on the cold floor, bleeding, slowly dying, while they, just a few miles away, toasted with expensive Italian wine and laughed at private jokes. Jessica wasn't a bad person by nature. She had never considered herself cruel or insensitive. She was ambitious, yes, and she knew it. Selfish in her professional choices, perhaps, but she wasn't cruel. She wasn't someone who consciously caused others pain. And the more she thought about that damned night, the more the guilt consumed her like acid, destroying her from the inside out. She had been complicit even without fully knowing what was happening. She had laughed with him when she should have insisted he go check on her. She had allowed his behavior with her passive complicity. A week after that night, Jessica made a decision. She went to a police precinct in downtown Manhattan, asked to speak with someone, and told them everything. She told them about the dinner, the ignored calls, the conversations they had. And then she revealed something she didn't even know would be so important. Richard had made a comment when they returned to the office days later, trying to control the narrative. He had asked her, if anyone asked, to say that the business meeting was absolutely unavoidable, that international investors were involved, that it was impossible to leave. An elaborate lie to justify the unjustifiable. But there were no investors, Jessica told the detective who was taking her statement, her hands trembling as she held a cup of cold coffee. It was just the two of us. A romantic dinner disguised as a work meeting. He asked me to lie, to help him, hide what really happened. The detective, a 40-year-old woman named Patricia Wallace, who specialized in crimes against women, listened with growing attention. When Jessica finished, she handed the young woman a business card. "You did the right thing coming here, and I know someone who will be very interested in talking to you." That someone was Rachel Adams, a lawyer specializing in civil rights and family law. At 38, Rachel had built a formidable reputation defending women in vulnerable situations. When Detective Wallace called her and explained the case, Rachel felt that familiar spark, that sense that she was on to something that could make a real difference. She visited Madison in the hospital a week later, after she had been moved to a regular room. She found a woman who was too thin, pale, but with eyes that burned with determination. Alan was there, as always, and he made the introductions. "Madison, this is Rachel Adams. She wants to talk to you about what happened." Rachel sat beside the bed and spoke with the direct honesty that characterized her work. "Madison, I'm going to be frank with you. What happened to you was extremely serious. Not just the abandonment itself, but the subsequent attempts to manipulate the narrative, to make you seem unstable, to downplay the severity of what occurred. I have evidence your father has gathered, plus the testimony of Richard's mistress, who came forward voluntarily to tell the truth. With all this, we can build a solid case." "What kind of case?" Madison asked, her voice still weak but firm. "Gross negligence, endangerment, obstruction of medical assistance, defamation. We can pursue this in both civil and criminal court. We can sue for damages, moral, physical, and psychological. We can petition for the termination of his parental rights over Michael. We can ensure he is held accountable for what he did." Madison looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked out the window, where the New York light streamed in softly, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. She thought of Michael, 2 floors below, fighting to gain weight, to breathe better, to grow. She thought of all the women who go through similar situations and have no voice, no resources, no justice. "I want to do this," she said finally. "Not just for me, but for all the women who are abandoned, disbelieved, called dramatic when they are literally dying. I want this to mean something. I want my pain to serve a purpose." Rachel smiled, a warrior's smile. "Then let's get to work." The lawsuit was filed a week later. The media picked up the story almost immediately. It wasn't every day that a millionaire entrepreneur was sued for abandoning his pregnant partner in labor to have dinner with his mistress. Social media exploded. Investigative journalists started digging, and that's when more things came to light. An investigative reporter named Megan Costa discovered that Richard had a history. 10 years earlier, he had been accused by an ex-girlfriend of similar behavior, though under less severe circumstances. The woman, Paula Miller, now married and living in Chicago, agreed to an interview. "He was always like that," Paula said to the camera, her voice calm but sad. "Charming, attentive at first, but incapable of being present when you really need him. When I had a miscarriage, he was on a business trip he could have postponed. When my mother died, he showed up at the wake but left before the burial because he had a meeting. Richard Sterling is a man who prioritizes himself above everyone and everything. Always has been, always will be. The pattern was established. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a mode of operation, a personality trait. The courtroom became a stage for painful but necessary revelations. The 911 recordings were played publicly, Madison's desperate voice echoing through the silent room. There were tears in the eyes of many present. The neighbor's video was shown, unequivocally demonstrating the gravity of the situation. The ambulance passing Daniel, captured by a nearby store's security camera, established that Richard was just feet away when Madison was rushed to the hospital, but he chose not to. Notice not to care. Jessica testified, visibly shaken, confirming every detail. Text messages between her and Richard, obtained by court order, revealed conversations that showed a total disregard for the situation. In one, sent 2 days after Michael's birth, Richard had written, "She's making a mountain out of a molehill as usual. In a week, everything will be back to normal." Richard's lawyers tried to argue that he had no way of knowing the true severity, that hospitals often exaggerate, that Madison had a history of anxiety during her pregnancy, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings didn't lie. The videos didn't lie. The witnesses didn't lie. And Richard himself, under the stress of cross-examination, ended up contradicting himself multiple times, each contradiction meticulously noted by the prosecution. The verdict came 3 months after the trial began. The judge, Charles E. Franklin, a 60-year-old man known for his rigor and sense of justice, read the verdict in a packed courtroom. Journalists, activists, onlookers, everyone wanted to be present for this historic moment. The defendant, Richard Sterling, is found guilty of gross negligence, endangerment, obstruction of medical assistance, and defamation. The evidence presented is irrefutable and demonstrates a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior. The defendant consciously chose to prioritize his own pleasure and convenience over the lives of his partner and child. His actions nearly resulted in 2 preventable deaths. His subsequent attempts to manipulate the narrative and make the victim appear unstable only aggravate his culpability. The sentence was severe: full and irrevocable termination of his parental rights over Michael, a $5 million settlement for moral, physical, and psychological damages, child support to be deposited into a trust for Michael until he reached adulthood, a permanent restraining order prohibiting Richard from approaching Madison and his son, and more. The story would be used as a case study in law and medical schools, ensuring the lessons learned would help future victims. When the verdict was read, Madison didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She just closed her eyes and took a deep breath, holding her father's hand. Justice didn't erase the pain, didn't heal the wounds, didn't turn back time. But it meant something. It meant her voice had been heard, her pain had been validated, that what happened to her mattered. The months that followed were a slow but steady reconstruction. Michael was discharged from the NICU 6 weeks after his birth, finally weighing the necessary 7 pounds and breathing on his own. Madison took him home, not to the mansion where she had almost died, but to Alan's house in Queens, where they stayed temporarily while she decided what to do with her life. The house in Queens was simple, warm, full of good memories. It was there that Madison began to find herself again. She would wake up in the middle of the night to feed Michael, looking at his perfect little face and feeling a mix of overwhelming love and terrifying responsibility. It was just her now, her and her son, and her father, of course, always present, always supportive. With part of the settlement money, Madison bought a spacious apartment in Soho, near the gallery where she worked. She decorated each room with care, creating a space that was hers, that represented who she was and who she wanted to be. Michael's room had light blue walls, delicate mobiles, and a comfortable armchair next to the crib where she spent hours just watching her son sleep. She returned to work at the gallery 4 months after the birth, leaving Michael with a trusted nanny recommended by Mrs. Peterson. It was hard at first, the separation anxiety tightening her chest every morning, but gradually she rediscovered her passion for art, for curating exhibitions, for talking with artists about their visions and inspirations. The work reconnected her with who she was before everything fell apart. But Madison wanted more. She wanted her experience to mean something bigger. That's how the Cecilia Hayes Institute was born, named in honor of Michael's grandmother, who hadn't lived to meet him. It was a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting women in vulnerable situations during pregnancy and postpartum. They offered free legal support, psychological counseling, emergency financial aid, and, most importantly, a safe space where women could share their stories without fear of being judged or disbelieved. The Institute's opening, 1 year after that fateful night, was covered by various media outlets. Madison gave an emotional interview, holding Michael in her arms, now a healthy, smiling 9-month-old. "I almost died thinking I was being dramatic, that I was exaggerating my pain," she told the cameras. "How many women die because they aren't taken seriously? How many stories are never told because the victims don't survive to tell them? This institute exists to change that, to tell every woman that her pain is real, that her life matters, that she deserves to be protected." Madison's story spread. She was invited to speak at universities, hospitals, and medical conferences. She wrote a book, I Survived, a story of abandonment and rebirth, which became a national bestseller. The proceeds were donated to the Institute, and slowly, very slowly, the wounds began to heal. Madison started therapy, processing the trauma, learning to trust again, to forgive not Richard, but herself for ignoring the signs. She learned that love shouldn't hurt, that care wasn't optional, that she deserved someone who would put her first. 2 years after that night, on a sunny October morning, Madison was sitting on the balcony of her Soho apartment. Michael, now an energetic and curious 2-year-old, was playing on the floor with colorful building blocks, constructing and demolishing towers with joyful laughter. The spring breeze drifted in gently, carrying the scent of flowers from a neighbor's garden and the distant sound of children playing in a nearby park. Alan, who had become a constant presence in their lives, appeared with a tray of fresh coffee and warm pastries. He sat next to his daughter, both of them watching Michael in comfortable silence. "You know you're incredible, right?" Alan said finally, turning to look at his daughter. "What you've built, who you've become. Your mother would be so proud." Madison smiled, taking her father's hand. "I learned from the best. You taught me that justice matters, that truth matters, that you don't give up on the people you love. And you taught your old man that strength doesn't come from not falling. It comes from getting up every time you do." They sat there watching Michael, who was now trying to stack an impossible block on top of an already unstable tower, his tongue sticking out in concentration. When the tower fell with a crash, he didn't cry. He just laughed and started building again. Madison looked at her son, and then at the blue October sky. "It's a new life now," she said softly, more to herself than to her father. Alan nodded, squeezing her hand. "And with justice, always with justice." Life went on. There were scars, yes. There were memories that still hurt on certain days, at unexpected moments. But there was also joy, growth, purpose. Michael was growing up strong and healthy, surrounded by love. The Institute was helping dozens of women every month. Madison had rediscovered herself not as the woman she was, but as the woman she chose to be. And Richard. Richard had lost everything that truly mattered. His name was publicly tarnished, his businesses suffered, friends abandoned him. Jessica moved on with her life, eventually marrying a university professor who treated her with the respect she didn't know she deserved. Richard's other past girlfriends began to speak out, sharing their own stories of neglect and abandonment. His pattern was exposed, documented, impossible to deny. But to Madison, Richard had become irrelevant. She no longer thought about him, didn't hate him, felt nothing but indifference. He was a closed chapter, a lesson learned, a story she told to help other women recognize the signs before it was too late. That morning on the balcony, as the October sun shone over New York, Madison realized something important. She had survived. More than that, she had thrived. She had transformed the greatest tragedy of her life into something bigger than herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt genuine peace. Michael toddled over to her, his steps still, a bit clumsy, and held out a colorful block. "Mommy, look!" Madison scooped her son into her arms, feeling his warm weight against her chest, hearing his joyful laugh. This was what mattered. This moment, this life. This chance they almost didn't have. The silence that had terrified her that October night 2 years ago, when she was alone and dying on the cold floor of an empty mansion, had been replaced by a different kind of silence. A silence that wasn't absence, but fullness. Not loneliness, but peace. Not an end, but a new beginning. And in that gentle silence, lulled by the sounds of the waking city, by her son's laughter, by her father's constant presence, Madison finally breathed free. Because she had discovered that she didn't need a man to be whole. She didn't need external approval to be valid. She didn't need anything more than what she already had: self-love, purpose, and the right people by her side. The story that had begun in darkness ended in light. And that light, Madison promised herself, would never go out again. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Madison and Michael has deeply touched your hearts. If you are moved by this journey of pain, resilience, and rebirth, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you the most. Was it Madison's strength, Alan's dedication, the justice that finally prevailed? Every day we bring you intense stories like this, narratives that reveal the deepest side of the human soul, that show that even from the greatest tragedies, we can be reborn stronger. Your presence here makes all the difference. We'll see you in the next episode with a new story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on life.